All right, so earlier I recorded a video um, answering the top three questions that people had, and I cut myself off at 30 minutes on the theory that I would make myself more efficient and get through it, but then I found myself explaining these points and I couldn't actually get through it. There were more here than what I could actually get through to if I was going to do the questions justice. So I decided to do round two. So here we are. This was not what I was intending to do, but it just tended to work out that way. So what I said was, please list the top three topics that most interest you about the war in Ukraine. Number them with one being the most interesting, then ask any questions that you have about them. Thanks. And I got down to, where did I get down to? I got down to here. My last question that I answered was, what was my thought on Viktor Orban Tucker Carlson interview? So if you want to see all those questions, you can go back to the last video and I answer them. I'm going to pick up here and I'm going to answer all the way to the end, and we'll see how long it takes. Some I might skip because I've answered it already. How likely is it that Trump could win a 2024 presidential election? I think it's incredibly likely that he could win the Republican nomination, but I don't know that that's necessarily probable. A lot can happen between now and then. Remember, it is now September, October, November, so 15 months between now and that election. So we'll see what happens. It really won't start to get hot until February or so. Once we get through February, March, April, we'll have a sense of what's happened there. But it is possible. I think it is less likely, it's not impossible, but less likely that he would win the general. Trump will, he has high positive regard in much of the Republican Party, but not all of it. And the problem is, though, that we don't have a single alternative to Trump. We have multiple alternatives to Trump. So we have, so for example, I'd be very comfortable with either Mike Pence or Nikki Haley or Tim Scott, or I'd even be okay with the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. A number of these would be legitimate alternatives to me. But because there's so many of them, I now have a real problem. DeSantis um, is another one that could get in there, although DeSantis is like, I can't quite tell where he is on Ukraine, and that's a big barometer for me. Um, we have many alternatives to Trump, and we only have one Trump. We have a minor Trump in Vivek, who is echoing some of Trump's kind of positions, and he's gaining in the polls as well because of that. But there's not, yeah. So at any rate, I think it's very possible that he could become the Republican candidate. It's less likely because of the high negatives that he would win the presidency, to my mind. Okay, should Zelensky government hold elections in 2024? So the short answer is I think that they should do everything that they can in order to keep the democracy acting like a democracy. Now, what does that mean as far as actually, maintaining or manning the election stations and that sort of thing? That's going to be a hard thing, a difficult task in the middle of a war. To the degree that they could do it, it would be wiser to do it. If they can't do it, it if they don't do it, it gives their enemies a pretext to say, see, he's just trying to hang on to power. Um, it's a tricky thing either way, but that's a great question. What do you think Russia will do in the event that they're forced out of Ukraine, including Crimea? Depends on how they're forced out. I mean, if they are forced out, so remember historically, perestroika and glasnost, why they did what they did in the Soviet Union. They were like, okay, we're no longer going to support you or prop you up because we can't. We're broke. We don't have the ability to hold you up. And the system that they had was geared to where they had to prop up certain areas. And so it just became too difficult to prop these up anymore. And that's why they went where they went. And I think Russia may very well be in that same place. Like, look, we can't even afford to try to maintain or rebuild or whatever. If that's the case, it's one thing. If they're forced out and they're angry, licking their wounds about it, I'm coming back and as soon as I can, that's a very different thing. So it's it's a difficult question to answer without having more facts. But they need to be beaten on the ground in order to have any chance of getting your children back and getting justice and getting war crimes tribunals and whatever else. Okay, check my Twitter. He sent me a message with a cartoon. By the way, if you want to interact with me, it's Professor Gerdes YT for YouTube at gmail.com, and you can send me things through that mechanism. Okay, number 3, why won't the U.S. come up with a defined plan with objectives and goals instead of this dribble of equipment here or there? Okay, there's a reason for that. It's a multi-part reason. The first thing is the Biden administration was trying not to trip over a red line to cause a nuclear war and or World War III. I get that, makes sense. Second part of that, though, is less appealing, and that is that Putin has done a really good job in deterring the United States, and he really has. Third part of that, it just takes time in order to get materials where they need to go. And by the time we realized, hey, the Russians don't do anything if we cross these red lines, it was already a year into the war. And so now we're still trying to get things out. And the fourth is that we have certain things that we want to give, and then certain things that are like, I don't know if we want to give these away. What if something pops up somewhere else in the world? We want to still be ready. And so you get what wouldn't undermine our readiness, and the readiness that they're looking at is potentially China as the next major threat, although a threat could come from many other quarters as well. So for all those reasons, it's less efficient than you would like it to be. But I mean, this is government talking, right? I mean, government is just not an effective mechanism to do much other than to um, they do some things very well, right? They can, uh, well, it's hard to enumerate, right? But one of the things that they do well is when they're committed to war, to actually conducting the war, to break things and kill people, right? They can do that well. Running other things effectively, the amount of coordination it takes to get this is often very difficult. Number 2, why won't the U.S. give longer range missiles? Ukraine has proved since day one of receiving military aid that they won't use it on Russia. Um, and so it's the same thing as what I just talked about. And number 1, Biden is being hyper careful with that, and I think that's unfortunate. What I think they need to do would be, which would be even better, is help Ukraine create the systems to build the things internally where they can create their own and then attack Russia. That would be even more useful. It's kind of like it's a difference between giving them a fish and giving them a fishing pole, right? I mean, it's teaching them to fish. And if they could do that, they can establish their own internal production, but that's a longer term thing. In the meantime, they're really struggling and they really need to have those longer range missiles. I agree, but um, I'm not making those decisions. If I was, it would be a different picture. What's your prediction when Ukraine takes out the Kerch Bridge so it's inoperable, and a timeline on getting Crimean Peninsula with force, not just special operations, and how NATO respond once they do? My crystal ball is broken, so I can't really tell you about the timeline, how long it'll take to get to the Kerch. I will tell you, I believe they will disable the Kerch Bridge. I said that in the last video as well. And yeah, I'm fairly convinced that they'll destroy the Kerch Bridge or make it inoperable. But I can't tell you a timeline on that. I know that they want to take the Crimean Peninsula, and that would be a huge boon. Okay. Number 1, the war and international politics. Where is Chinese peace delegation hiding? The Chinese are in just a really different place, and we fool ourselves, trick ourselves into thinking that they want what the Russians want because we don't know them well enough. You have to know your enemy so well that you think like them, and the Chinese aren't thinking. They're not monolithically thinking like Russians. They're in a different place. I think the Chinese want this to be over. They really. I My read is that they were okay with this as almost like, go ahead and take this, and then we're going to go take that. But it backfired tremendously, and now they just want it to be over, and they want to rebuild their new Silk Road and have everybody stop fighting so they can get on with trade. That's my read of the Chinese. But I don't know where their peace delegation is hiding, but that puts them in a very awkward kind of position. Number 2, what can we learn from the war? Wow. That's a great question. That's Julia Richard 6987. That is a phenomenal question. We're going to be unpacking the lessons from this war for years, if not decades. Can we something that helps us protect your democracies? Can we stop? I don't know. STH, something that helps us protect our democracy. I'm not sure exactly what that last question is, but number two was worth three questions. That was great, and we're going to learn not just military lessons, but political lessons. Like one of the fundamental divides here between myself and people like me on one side supporting Ukraine and people like Tucker on the other side, Tucker Carlson and the Russian repeaters, is like you can't allow a bad actor like Putin to go on and just grab up land and then make a deal with him and be, oh, okay, it's all right. That's we're going to make this deal with you. You just encourage more of that kind of thing. On his side, he's thinking, "Oh no, this is bad. They're going to nuke us. So we can't do this." No, you've got to stop it. It's the balance of power has been happening for hundreds of years, thousands of years, maybe. So you just can't let it fester. Okay. Number one, innovative use of drones. We talked about that in the last video, so I'm going to skip, I think, specifically how naval drones are changing the face. Well, no, I'm gonna talk about this. Naval drones are changing the face of warfare, and things like the Australian cardboard drones. I talked about the Australian cardboard drones 2 days ago, I think it was. I just found that so fascinating. Like they have these cardboard. Now they cost somewhere near $3,000 because of the military grade GPS and the payload, the bomb, the explosives on it. But the frame is basically cardboard, and that makes the cardboard drone nearly undetectable by radar. Like you could see it maybe, but you can't actually pick it up by radar very easily. It would get it confused with birds or something along those lines. Um, so that's one thing. And then the naval drones are changing warfare as well. So the jet ski like drone that hit the Kerch, or now they're working on underwater submersibles. And you gotta, like you were talking about, what lessons can we learn from the war up here? You have to understand militaries all over the world are paying attention to this and going, you know what? This is revolutionizing warfare, the way that the Ukrainians are doing what they're doing. And they've been incredibly innovative. Okay, how much private funding through donation for vehicles and equipment is happening and how it helps? I'm not really the best guy to answer that question. I'm ill-equipped to answer that question. I know that things are happening, and I've consistently from day one put down Samaritan's Purse link in my description below on almost every video. Then I added United 24, and I did that because I don't know personally know some of the other charities that could have been involved, and because I don't know them, I'm relying on the reputation and the trust that I have in these particular charities. The first one I already trusted when United 24, I'm pretty sure that's a fairly safe place to give as well. Okay, the implications of a Russian victory on nuclear proliferation and the collapse of the UN. So, if I'm hearing this right, what if Russia wins? How will that affect nuclear proliferation? I'm not sure if it will affect nuclear proliferation other than to Russia's friends and allies. Um, but I don't think a Russian victory is terribly likely. It's going to be a long, hard slog, but I think in the end, Ukraine will prevail with the partners that it has, equipping it with what it had. If it didn't, Russia could have walked in there and just taken over, and it would have been over in no time flat. But once partners got involved, it changed the game radically for the equation for Russia. The calculus changed. Okay, the reasons that given by Biden administration not to send ATACMS to Ukraine. We just talked about that above with those different variables, and so I'm not going to go on to that. Who decides what weapons are sent to Ukraine? Well, it's going to ultimately be the Biden administration in the U.S. and then the administrations of each country, and they have to. So, Zelensky's got his hands full, right? I mean, he's got to interact with all these different, or Zelensky and his designees have to interact with all these different partner countries. Now, they try to work out what they need through the Ramstein agreements and those kind of things, but That's a pretty tricky thing to work out. What do Congress members cite for being against supporting Ukraine? Okay, so there are some like Marjorie Taylor Greene and what's his name in Florida. He's fairly prominent loudmouth Republican who, in some regards, are just conservative. In other regards, are very Trumpian, populist, very anti-Ukraine. So the most common reason to not support Ukraine is not that they're pro-Russia. And this is an important distinction. I did a video about this and it got very little traction, maybe because I labeled it a certain way. But I was talking about how I was just thinking about this. I was at the library and the librarian had a Ukraine pin on. And I thought, huh, that's interesting. I've seen people wearing a Ukraine flag. I've seen a Ukraine flag flying from a post in front of a house. I've seen it on bumper stickers. I've not seen any Russia like that. And I think that there's a difference here. People that are pro-Ukraine are trying to support Ukraine. Maybe they're trying to punch Russia in the nose too, but they're trying to support Ukraine. People on the other side of the equation don't necessarily say I'm pro-Russia. They make other excuses of why we shouldn't be involved. And I think when you're talking about members of Congress citing for being against supporting Ukraine, it's like, well, we're not doing anything about the southern border, or we have crime in these cities. We should be spending our money here. But it's not. We shouldn't be doing this. We need to be working with Russia because Russia is going to be very few voices will say, Russia, we have to work with Russia again, or something along those lines. They don't talk like that. They do in France. I mean, they do talk about that kind of thing in France, but in the US, I don't hear that kind of rationale. It's more like we should be focused on this rather than that, where I don't think you can just let it go. I think it's if you let it go, that's going to be a very bad thing. Okay, next, let's keep going. How to support Ukraine, both military and humanitarian issues. Um, like find an appropriate um, charity that you feel comfortable giving to. I've talked about the ones that I do. I'm working with potentially doing a promotion with St. Javelin, where what would come to me is going to go back into their charity, and I think that's the way to go. Just find these charities to give to, and some of them are like giving military equipment as their charitable goods. You see the Enforcer or Suchomimus or whoever doing those kind of things. Find those that you can trust and give to. How to amplify Russian voices that support Ukraine. That's very, very difficult. I don't even know how to start that. And what good are they going to do? If they're talking in the West, they're not talking to Russians who need to hear it and getting them to be able to talk to Russians who need to hear it. Wow, that's hard. I mean, that's a very difficult question. How to influence our elected officials to support Ukraine. So if you're in the West, like in the United States, like I am, then contact your legislators and let your voice be heard and do it regularly. Pound the drums. Find your friends that are doing it and make sure that you're constantly letting them know. Because they will listen to you. I mean, this is the United States, and they'll listen to that influence. And they, other places where there's an authoritarian regime, they can ignore you, but they can't hear, particularly as you get closer to an election cycle. Okay, what happened to the thousands of children stolen by Russia? We don't know. They're, as far as we know, either in orphanages or placed with homes, and the idea is to indoctrinate them as a Russian kind of indoctrination. And if you look at the population map, like it looks like a tree, like the size of the population. There's lots of old people and then very few young people, and Russians need them just like the Ukrainians do, and it's genocidal without killing, if I can describe it that way. It's trying to brainwash, take your children, brainwash them, put them over here, and make them hate your country, and it's very awful. So number two, the importance of documenting this invasion and spreading Russian cruelty of the world. That's part of my rationale of doing this as well, was the documentation. I figured if it's on YouTube, it'll just be out here and people will be able to see what's going on. And that's very important. It needs to not be forgotten. What are the plans to rebuild Ukraine when Russia is defeated? So once we get to that, you're going to see most of the free world having a part in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be move from the margins to somewhat center of Europe, and I don't mean geographically, but I mean like they will take a lot more focus than they have historically had, and they'll become a pretty significant power within Europe in time because they'll be rebuilt by the West and have major connections to the West. And I think Ukraine will be far better on the other side, other than the lives lost, far better rebuilt on the other side than where they are now, or where even they were before. It's going to be that this sounds terrible to say it like that, because I'm now calculating, even as I'm speaking, the tremendous toll of lives, and I'm not minimizing that. But on the other side, the Western powers will be working to rebuild, and on top of that, if they win, and I believe they will, and if it's correctly done, Russia's going to be paying reparations for rebuilding Ukraine as well, but there'll be all kinds of industry coming into Ukraine um, that wasn't there before. That's my read. I could be wrong. Number one, Ukraine logistics. The number one thing that the joint project could help the war effort would be constructing a new rail line that has the same track gauge as the European lines. Yeah, that's a real significant problem, and I've seen that identified in multiple places. At the beginning of the war, there was discussion of creating one. Has there been any progress? I don't know that there has been any progress. I don't know that this is the time to make that progress, but yes, they will. They will de-Sovietize more and integrate more into the European sphere on the other side of this. Why hasn't Zelensky addressed the Russian population directly? He has on multiple occasions, but of course, how much were they able to actually hear? But he's put out messages in Russian to Russia, and like he grew up speaking primarily Russian as opposed to Ukrainian. That was normal in Ukraine for many years. Remember, he was a child while it was still the Soviet Union, so I mean, he speaks to it very often. Why is Russia not losing faster with so much problems? Other already gave up. I'm not sure I understand the end of this, but why are they not losing faster with so many problems? Is a good question. A lot of what's happened in Russia is a lot of unforced errors, that they're just not that good at certain things, and they kind of pants themselves militarily before the world. Before this invasion, they were far more feared than they are now, and now they seem to be bogged down and struggling. One, cardboard drones, are they a real thing? Are they effective? If they are, and how Ukrainians have come to use them, Russian territory when they're not allowed to. This is a great question. Um, how are they allowed to use them on Russian territory when they're not allowed to use Western weapons on Russian territory? So they come from Australia. Australia is not part of NATO. Now, Australia's kind of put themselves out there in doing that by, Russia could declare war on Australia, but then that would, as tight an ally as Australia is with the West, it wouldn't be very long before that would backfire on Russia in a huge way. So it's not coming from the US or Britain or France or something along. It's coming from Australia. That's how come they can use them. How come Ukraine is not attacking? Oh, by the way, cardboard drones are the real thing. They are a legit thing, and they've been able to penetrate and get in. Now, they're going to be limited in their payloads, but still, nonetheless, they've been able to inflict some damage. How come Ukraine is not attacking shipping, which is clearly being used to steal grain and trade grain with Iran for weapons? Three, okay, before I get to three. So they're, I'm sure, working on attacking shipping or getting their ducks in a row, no pun intended, in order to be able to attack the Kerch and the shipping lanes. They've created some havoc just by hitting one. So the threat, I talked about, the threat is more powerful than the actual attack. The threat of that has really created havoc in the Black Sea, and you'll see more to come. But let me go on to number three. Will China end up either buying or taking or negotiating ownership of Outer Manchuria given Russian government's worsening position? I don't perceive that. I don't see that anything like that's going to happen, but something could happen somewhere down the line that I just don't perceive. I don't think that Russia's going to collapse and China will just grab it up or something along those lines. I think it will be worn down little by little by little by little until it just has to say, "Hey, uncle, we're just going to stop with this." Okay, number one, low morale and AWOL Russian fighters. That's interesting. There is, and this is something that I focus on a lot, is the morale or the infighting within the Russian army or things along those lines. That's a very powerful way of understanding what's happening or why things aren't happening like they should be for the Russians. Counteroffensive progress, that's also very interesting. I watch a lot of that, but I don't speak to a lot of that because of where I sit. I'm not a military guy, but my PhD is in org leadership, which is why I pay attention to morale and the infighting within the leadership, because it's the Russian MOD is just an organization, and it makes sense to me. And the Russian economy, that's also big. And I think this is going to be their weakness. And this is where the war is going to eventually end. It's because economically they're kind of forced to do it. I don't mean through sanctions. I mean that they have just been ground down economically where they can't keep going. Okay, how can I get my government to do more to help Ukraine with the war? We've already talked about that, and it's a great question. Contact your legislators and keep contacting them about supporting Ukraine. Ask them what personally they are doing, what bills they are sponsoring, or what they're voting on. Ask them to give you a list of the record of how they voted, and tell them that you are going to vote for them or against them based on what they do here. How do I convince my government to support NATO, making Ukraine a member with Article 5 protection and evict the illegal Russian occupiers? Well, they can't do that while Russia holds those 5 oblasts or they lose those oblasts, and that's an untenable position. But immediately after they gain the ground, becoming a NATO member as quickly as humanly possible is important. How can I get my government to do more to help Ukraine win the war with Russia? Again, what I said in number one is the same thing, and just keep pressing. Okay, number one, Ukraine progress in taking back all their territory. Yeah, so that is what they need in order to win this war, and in order to prosecute it and get that they need to get all their ground back and then settle after that. Russia karma for starting and continuing this unnecessary war. I think that that's a really good way of saying it is karma. They're going to experience some significant ill effects for generations for having started this war. 3, long-term peace for the betterment of all. Remember when people in the West were saying that Ukraine should abandon Bakhmut to Wagner, and now Wagner is disbanded and Prigozhin is dead. Maybe the West should trust Ukraine knows what they're doing. Yeah, that's a valid point. The West should trust that Ukraine knows what they're doing. I've been very, very impressed with the Ukrainians and their ability to conduct the war. It's not been perfect, but they've been pretty impressive. Number one, the mental side on the front lines on both sides. It's tough. It's a tough slog, and for Ukrainians, they don't really get to. I mean, they're rotating in and out, but they're not like your time of service is over. You can go home. It's martial law, and they have to fight. Um, and on the Russian side, there's very little motivation to fight other than to survive. Will Russia pay for the damage to Ukraine and Ukrainians' families, and how will things look going forward? Depending, okay, that question is a great question, but it depends on how the peace is concluded. And if they win militarily and force Russia to say uncle, then they can then get those reparations. Other agreements might not, and so you got to be careful about how you conclude that peace. Do you think there's another reason for this war? Is Putin is sick, maybe? Thank you. Now, so I don't get into this kind of like, well, Putin has a body double. Putin is sick. Putin is mentally deranged. He is out of his mind. I can't get into that. I can't psychoanalyze him like that. So I don't know. I think he just, I mean, has let's use Occam's razor. He just has these grand ambitions, and he thinks that he's going to get that. Um, or let's be as kind as possible. NATO is encroaching. Well, NATO's not encroaching. They're running away from Russia, these countries are running away from Russia into the arms of the safety of NATO because you are a threat. But nonetheless, if he perceives NATO as a threat because of that, maybe that's what's driving it. But I can't psychologically diagnose him like that. Okay, the religious aspect of the conflict, that's the Orthodox Church of Ukraine versus the Russian Orthodox Church, I think is what they're trying to ask here. Ukraine arresting priests and why Russia is arresting priests in the occupied territories and why. Yeah, because at least the Russian Orthodox Church is being used for military purposes or being supplementing military, and so you can't really allow that to go on because I mean you can't. I mean it's well, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and so it's a bad look, but I mean it is what it is. In Russia, you'll have just as much opposition or persecution, even though all the highlight, and I've read about articles about this, all the highlighting tends to be about what Ukraine is doing to Russian Orthodox priests. The treatment of priests speaking out against the war in Russia is not good. As conservatives, how should we think about and approach Trump candidacy versus someone else we're not fond of? I think voting against myself for Ukraine if needed, not voting Republican. Okay, so I've been asked about this a lot. I live in a state in the United States that's the way it works is the state casts their votes for the president. In the primary, you have a choice. In the general, it's really like whatever the aggregation of the state is. And I live in a very conservative state that's going to vote Republican regardless. So in the general, whoever is the primary candidate um, for the general election is going to get the vote. So I mean, I could throw away my vote in the general and it won't really matter. Um, but in the primary, that's where the action is. And in the primary, trying to get the candidate of your choosing, that's where it works. It's like the inverse of the parliamentary system in Britain. We form our majority and then have one-on-one contest between the Democrats and the Republicans, as opposed to vote for anyone and then like have to form the coalitions after. Um, so, I mean, I know who I want to vote for in the primary, and it's not Trump. Trump's just he's all wrong on Ukraine, and this is a very big issue. Um, so I'm voting for one of the other candidates that, and there's a number to choose from. We just talked about a number of candidates who I could, with a straight face, no problems. They full-throatedly support Ukraine, and I have choices there. Unfortunately, there's so many choices, it waters down that vote, and so I might have to think strategically about which one has the greatest chance in um, collecting the points within the system. Okay, are there conservative Republican groups for Ukraine? I can pound the pavement with this in terms of getting the right narrative out. There are, it's surprisingly few, other than like, a few YouTubers or something along those lines. But there's not a lot of groups, and if you're a conservative, you feel like a voice crying in the wilderness because all the left is supporting, most of the left is supporting Ukraine, and then all the attention is on conservative, or not conservatives, on Republicans supporting the other side. But that's not true. It's not. I mean, there are Republicans supporting the anti-Ukraine support kind of faction, but there's conservatives that are supporting and they don't get a lot of attention. So I don't know. You can watch here. Um, Cardboard drones, we already talked about. I can't find any commentary on this. Nobody seems to mention it, but the Australians become the first nation to consent to their weapons being used on Russian territory, but they're not NATO. And so that's kind of, we just addressed that above. I guess if the Western allies wanted to test the reaction to this, it would make sense to get a non-NATO country such as Australia to go first. That's actually a really brilliant insight. I mean, I don't know if that's what they're doing, but they are effectively doing that. The Russian economy, why does the IMF seem to accept Russia's false reported numbers despite acknowledging that they have almost no visibility over the true state of their economy? What else can they do? I mean, they can't actually see in, so they can't deny that the Russians are telling the truth when they don't know. They highly suspect, but they don't know. It promotes a Russian talking point that sanctions are not having an impact, but it's still having an impact. So it's still grinding them down, even though the narrative is that way. So that's okay. The IMF is predicting a 1.3 growth in Russia economy in 2024, which just isn't possible according to most experts. And the talking point is very effective propaganda. But when you can't, it's okay. It's kind of like, um, multiple times I've seen Starsky talk about how the Russians claim that they've killed 1,000 Ukrainians and two General Saluzhnys and the Deep Space Nine orbiter and whatever else. And like you can only claim too much so long before it's revealed that the king has no clothes, right? I mean, eventually when they don't hit 1.3% growth, but then they have a significant problem on the other side, like it just doesn't work, will know that they were lying about it. Okay, Ukrainian elections. I get that it's logistically difficult to hold an election during a war, but shouldn't Western allies insist on this happening in order to maintain support? Imagine our reaction if the Russian election scheduled for 2024 were postponed due to the special military operation. I agree with you. I would agree that if it is at all practically possible, they should do that. It's going to be, but I'm sitting in the high seats, right? I mean, I don't have to try to make it happen. Okay. One, assuming Trump will be reelected, what consequences has it to the Ukraine war? Can Trump make Russia great again policy be successful? I don't think that's what Trump's trying to do. I don't think he's trying to make Russia great again. I don't think he's like trying to actively support Putin. I think Trump is about Trump, and he thinks that he can make a deal, and he's willing to sacrifice Ukrainians on the altar of Trump. But he's not trying to make Russia great again. That's unfair, and I don't want to be unfair to any side. And if you watch enough of my videos, you'll recognize that I'm even fair to people like Scott Ritter. Yeah, okay. So just hear that. Um, so what can Trump do? Well, Trump can radically change things, but will he? I mean, will he have like? There's going to be um, so much resistance to that I think it will be hard for him. And I think Lend-Lease will still be in play on the books. And I think before Biden goes out, if there is if Trump did win, I think before he got into office, they would authorize a bunch more billions of dollars worth of aid for Ukraine to sustain them for a good long time, um, and put that into place before Trump got in. And I could see that happening. Will the BRICS become a real alliance that can stabilize Russian economy or elongate the war until the West is tired, like Afghanistan and Iraq? So I talked about the BRICS adding these other 6 players to the BRICS. I don't think that's going to have that much of an impact. I mean, the G7 are like Nike, Adidas, Reebok, that kind of thing. These new players are like Fila and Vans and Walmart brand and One sneakers. I mean, it just they're not really what value are they adding other than that I mean the size in human population, sure, but the actual purchasing power and ability there is not that significant, to my mind, that it's going to somehow stabilize Russia. But that's what Russia has to do. You're on track. That's exactly what Russia's going to need to do. Long term, that could be something that helps Russia, but in the near term, I don't think it's going to do nearly what Russia hopes it will do. Okay, Russia asset seizure to fund Ukraine rebuilding. Seizures violate international law, so it would seem that Russia would have to authorize transfer. Is there any movement here? That's one of the things that Russia complains about in their new history textbook, that the West has seized our assets and this and they're like only showing one side of the story, not that they've crossed international lines. Like once you just simply cross over into another country, that's an act of war before you even shoot, right? And so they're not talking about that, but they're talking about seizing assets. That really makes them pretty angry. Um, Russian asset seizure for to fund rebuilding. So I don't know that that's the best way of going about doing that. I think freezing is right, and then because you're seizing individuals' assets that may or may not be responsible for what's going on. It needs to come the funding for the rebuilding needs to come from the state, from reparations that come from their oil and gas and whatever else. Okay, how many Russian blasts will be speaking Chinese by 2030? That's pretty funny. Um, I don't think that that's going to happen, but it could. I mean, there could be something there. Um, that seems like quite an outside possibility. The BRICS Kumbaya Summit in Saudi Arabia. How many participants will donate their own territory to end the war? Actually, post-war Ukrainian recovery, psychological and economic are my main concerns. Yeah, this is going to be something really significant. Like, It's been devastating what's happened to Ukraine. They'll rebuild and they'll rebuild better, but like you can't replace the lost loved ones. I mean, you can't. And there's going to be PTSD and all kinds of problems. So I know I'm jumping the gun, and no worries. That should be something that you should be thinking about. Okay, number one, what are air defense doing when Putin's airplane crash and the Kerch Bridge on fire 3.0? So air defense is getting progressively better, and they're working on that. And Ukrainians have, with the limited materials that they have, they've done a phenomenal job. When will Putin's airplane crash? Putin travels by rail more often than not. An armored rail car. He knows, he's very paranoid, and he knows that bad things can happen when you go up in an airplane. He knows that very well. Kerch Bridge on fire 3.0, it will happen. There will be another attack on the Kerch. I can almost guarantee it, but I can't predict when. I'm a student of history. I read Pablam's very well-respected biography of Gorbachev. I cannot understand how any historian could speak highly of Reagan if they studied the late Soviet history or read the book. Reagan genuinely believed the Star Wars fairy tale, and when offered complete denuclearization by the Soviets, refused because the Soviets wanted him to abandon the fantasy of Star Wars. He offered an end to the Afghan war so long as he could stop funding the Mujahideen until the Soviets could distract their army in Kabul. He said no, allowing the war to drag on a few military years. He also called, okay, so apparently you're not the man was out of the cast of Dumb and Dumber. I think you have, as a student of history, I give you a not so great grade, and I'm not trying to be mean or anything, but you're only seeing one side of this, or one. Taubman's very well respected biography of Gorbachev. You're getting a pretty jaundiced view of Reagan. Um, I, it's not really fair to only look at that. He's also the one that called the Soviet Union the evil empire and stood up to them, and and even in Grenada was the first time that the Soviets were ever rolled back anywhere. Like, he had some guts. He was willing to walk away from a deal with Gorbachev at Reykjavik, and he actually understood that you have to deal with them. They're only respecting force, and you're only willing to stand up. He was willing to share a future Star Wars technology with the Soviets in the process. I think you're not understanding Reagan, and yeah, I've read multiple biographies of Reagan, and this is what you have placed here is not enough. This is very much a caricature of him. Whether I don't believe that you meant to, but you've not given him enough. You've not fully painted the picture of Reagan. Okay, frontline support, medical care, trucks for evacuation, and proper equipment for saving lives. Okay, I think we've talked about that to some degree. That's the thing that you're interested in, and like channels like the Enforcer, Mercado, and Combat Veteran Reacts are going to talk more about that than I am. But I'm asking what you're interested in, and thank you for that. How the soldiers deal with stress. That's tough. Ukraine has been promised security guarantees by the U.S. and U.K. Why Ukraine is not getting the support that they need? Well, they're getting the support that they have because of that. The U.K. is making good. The U.S. is making good. Russia was one of the partners that was supposed to guarantee that. Fun facts about you, food, dog, or cat. Okay, so I have a cat named Reagan. This is one of the reasons why I'm telling you, like, you, as a student of history, you're not saying enough about him. You don't understand him fully. But my third cat, I didn't want any cats, but I love my wife, and my wife loves cats. So my third cat is named Reagan. That's a fun fact for you. Okay. Ozzy asks, who does Putin trust and listen to? Putin trusts Putin. I don't know that he trusts anybody else fully. He trusts Shoigu enough to keep him in place even though he's incompetent. But it's not like trust like he's brilliant. It's trust like, and you see this with dictators a lot. It's trust like, I don't believe he'll stab me in the back, not I trust his competence. When and how will the Putin regime collapse? I think economically it will slowly dissolve, and then there'll be a sudden something that will shift, but I don't know when. I can't predict that, and that's only if they're ground down far enough. Again, attacking their oil If they could disable some of the oil, and I know that's improbable, it's very unlikely, but if they could do that, that would accelerate this like nothing else I can think of. Will the USA elect a firmly pro-Ukraine victory president? Don't know. It's too far out to be able to tell. I'll have a clearer picture of this in about March of next year, because we'll see so much. After Super Tuesday, we'll have a good sense of whether Trump is still a real front runner or not. Super Tuesday is a day in the United States where 7 of our 50 states all vote on the same day, and before that, it goes from Iowa to New Hampshire to South Carolina, and then it keeps going through a number of states, and they're casting their electoral votes for that the president at that time. Okay, why is no one talking about the Budapest Memorandum? Man, I've been talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. How do we know that they won't run away if NATO Article 5 is invoked? That's a great question. That is possible. I mean, but if they do, NATO is pointless and useless. Why hasn't the Ukraine just taken a navy up the Don River? So they are trying to use the river in order to escort ships out, but that's not nearly as useful as some other things that they could do. Let's see, how much more do I have here? Did Ukraine really give back all of the 1,000? Okay, so did they give back the nukes? So they didn't actually own the codes. The Russians owned the codes. They gave back the physical nukes, but they didn't control it. Like, it was controlled out of Moscow. So it wouldn't have done them much good at the time anyway. So they were like, yeah, sure, we'll give it up. We'll have security guarantees. And that's why they didn't have an army, because they didn't need one. They had security guarantees. The bridge, take it out. Yes, I agree. What's wrong with the Pope? The Pope's comments, I don't think he was trying to make something inflammatory. I think he was just trying to encourage the priests there, and he used a terrible metaphor or terrible example that really was kind of tone deaf. Russian Legion head back into the north and draw RA troops out from the front. That could happen, and the Russian Legion could very well have been who was launching these drones, and there's multiple attacks inside. We just don't know yet. Number one, victory conditions. What must Russia also give to Ukraine after all the territory is recovered? Money, land, children. You're not mentioning children. They need to get their children back. Um, but certainly money. There certainly should be reparations. Land, that would be interesting. Give them all. Give Ukraine all the oblasts surrounding Ukraine as a buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. I think that would be nice. That would be what they should have to do. Olympics. When will Kyiv host the Summer Olympics again? Well, it's going to take about a decade to clear all the mines, so it might be a while. Weapons. Which weapon has killed the most Russians? Artillery, generally speaking, has done the most damage, as far as I understand. Number one, when will Ukraine kick Russians? Okay. Number two, when will Ukraine keep hit deep into Russia? And they're starting to more and more. Number three, every time Ukraine advances, you want to pay attention to that, and I understand. I do too. Turret loss distance championship. There are memes about turret long distance turret toss long distance championship. Look that up. Ukrainian ingenuity, man, they're freaking brilliant, and I highlight that very often. And then number three was ridiculous Russian propaganda. That's what I also spend my time on. Okay, I think this is the last comment. I don't do homework or use self-checkout. You're asking us to do your homework for you. Okay, so I think that's because I said, what are the top 3 things that you're interested in and what questions can I answer? But I'm not asking you to do my homework for me. I'm asking, how can I serve you better? What can I do to answer your questions more effectively? So I guess Philip Oopson, I mean, whatever. There are some replies here as well. Let me see some of the replies. That's an incredibly rude and stupid comment. Okay, who is this? Hakan Gustafson. Thank you. You get the gold star. You get an A plus because that was a rude and stupid comment. The professor wants a dialogue with the audience. We should be thankful. Well, yeah, I want a dialogue. I want to be able to answer your questions more effectively. So don't do homework. We don't have to share a perspective honestly isn't rude, nor is it stupid. Pull your head out of your, yeah, and get over yourself. As a U.S. submarine veteran, I'm entitled to speak my mind. You are entitled to speak your mind, but people are allowed to speak their mind and call you rude when you do something like that. Oh, let's see. Somebody else said that. Yes, my friend, you're entitled to your own opinion and views. Plus, you get to vote on the results in the situation. I believe we get a good perspective from both sides. That's fair. So you do get to speak your mind, but this was patently unhelpful to say I don't do homework or self-checkout. You're asking us to do homework. I'm just asking, what do you want me to address so that I can address it? That's all. Okay, speaking of that, I've now addressed it far longer than I meant to. I was trying to limit it like I did in the first video to just a half hour. Here, we got another 50 minutes or so, but I hope I've helped you understand more of the context of what's happening in Ukraine. Thank you very much for the likes and the shares and the subscribes. If you're not subscribed, would you please consider it? Thank you for the coffees. I greatly appreciate the encouragement. Thank you more than anything else for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. If you're still listening to me, you've really shown that you care, because you would only listen this far if you really cared about Ukraine. Thank you so much. Talk to you tomorrow.